This session has been designed and nurtured lovingly by Kemi, who is Galdem's features editor. And when we got the brief in, she was initially really keen to explore how people of color's experience has been unpacked through use of the absurd in films like Get Out and Sorry to Bother You. So we've got two incredible filmmakers who work across lots of different formats, documentary, music video. It's quite hard to put either Akin or Jade into a box. I don't think Jade will mind me saying that she's worryingly obsessed with gore and horror, and those are themes that you see threaded through her work. She's made films which have explored themes of asylum, female desire, and gender fluidity most recently. Whilst Akin's films, including This Hair of Mine, and most recently Black to Life, which hopefully some of you will have seen for the BBC, was kind of reimagining the history that we aren't taught in school and that we should be taught in school. So yeah, they're going to have a conversation around how surrealism has shaped or informed their work. So let's welcome them to the stage.
Hello. I'm Kemi, as you just heard, and to add more hype to the people on the stage, this is Akinola Davies Jr., goes by Crack Stevens, I call him Crack. This is Jade Jackman, and together they both produce films that are extremely experimental in a pleasing way. So I thought they were perfect to bring in for this topic. This talk is about surrealism, magic realism, and to tell you what that is, realism is sort of when the artist doesn't really have much interference with what you see, so it's very true to life, whereas magic realism adds fantastical elements, and with surrealism, it completely bends what you expect from reality. And rather than that just being an artistic tool, it can also be a social and political tool. So we've seen that with films like Get Out, Sorry to Bother You, Atlanta, and that sort of whole crop of film coming out right now. So I just wanted to show a VT, a clip, and I don't know whether it's going to, probably on those screens down there, and we're going to see what that looks like in action.
Good to see another brother around here.
Chris was just telling me how he felt much more comfortable with my being here. Get out.
Sorry, man.
Get out! Yo!
Sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
Mine is a terrible thing to waste. Terrible thing to waste.
Stick to the script.
Hey, hello. Mr. Davison, cash your screen here. Sorry to bother.
Let me give you a tip. You want to make some money here? Use your white voice.
My white voice.
I'm never talking about Will Smith's wife, like this young blood.
Hey, Mr. Kramer. This is Langston from Regal View.
As always, we'll be getting that out to you right away.
At the end of a life, the voice of the land remains. It takes form. Fire of Ogun, water of Oshun. My father's father left me gifts. Red sun, red earth, and these eyes I see with.
I'm strong and I'm still hopeful. I'm still optimistic. because, like they say, freedom is in the mind.
So, what I was trying to show you there is that there are lots of techniques that can take you out of reality, but in those films, they all help you question things that actually do happen. So first off, I was going to ask you guys how you've incorporated surrealism into your work and how that's helped you tell the stories and highlight the issues that you wanted to. You can start.
Hi everyone, by the way, I'm Jade. And yeah, I guess me and Akin have slightly different routes, everyone has slightly different routes into film, but initially I started studying law and anthropology at London School of Economics. And studying those two things were quite interesting at the same time because anthropology, very much like documentary, in my opinion, has often been made by white people about the other. And so a lot of experiences, especially at the time, a lot of people were making work about the refugee crisis. And I think if anyone who's gone through the experience of migration or detention, or just even had visas and different things, a lot of the stuff almost got very overwhelming to keep seeing these very repeated images of black and brown bodies, and the news stories felt very inhuman. There wasn't very much understanding. There was really no humanity, I thought, in it, and actually we still see a lot of that stuff now. I think again and again we see loads of black and brown people trying to get somewhere, and I found that those images were very easily then used by people like Nigel Farage or whoever and just stuck as this clamor. And it was just really gross, and a lot of very reputable people were kept making that imagery, and I really wondered how you started making work that was similar but was more human and was more relatable. So that's how I started thinking about making the film that was about Yarlswood. So I think that kind of framed my understanding of why I would make documentaries or represent reality in a different way.
And to those in the audience who don't know, Yarlswood is a detention centre, and you made a film that was looking at the conditions of that detention centre without actually going in and showing the women.
Well, I think also I couldn't do that, so that wasn't an option because it's completely illegal to film in immigration and removal centres. People have everything literally taken away from them, and then so you'll have a phone, your own phone, and then because everyone now has smartphones, but you're not allowed anything with a camera or recording device on it, so then they give you a brick phone, as well as you're only allowed to bring one bag of clothes with you. So I couldn't go in and film things in a normal way, so then again you had to think about how you could do that. But I think another thing that I found a big problem with documentary is that people are often captured in the worst moment of their life. So actually these kind of disembodied phone recordings from the women actually meant that you could find a way that didn't feel like you were just sort of taking from people in that moment and actually make it more relatable. And that's why maybe it ended up looking more surreal, I think.
So I started assisting loads of directors because I couldn't get a job after uni. But the reason I make the sort of things I make was because I grew up in Nigeria, then I went to English countryside straight away, so it's quite a juxtaposition. And what I always found in sort of work that reflected black people, especially my trajectories through music, so I would always see a really exoticized, hyper-masculine, or a narrative that just felt really kind of boring after a while. It was kind of either projecting a bad boy image or someone who has loads of money, and often enough I just felt that wasn't the reality. I was more interested in how everyday people live, and because I find that every day really fascinating. I find just the things we do, the food we cook, the way we dress, the way we do our hair, I just think there's a certain element of sort of magic in all those moments. So my focus generally is trying to like film like the norm, but just like give it a sense of a fantasy, I guess.
And do you have like a specific example that you could share with the audience of like when you think surrealism has been done well in order to unpack a social issue?
That's a tough question. A moment that's been done in my work or just in general?
Any. If you choose you, it does make you look like you're full of yourself, though.
Okay, so I won't choose me. There's I don't know, maybe many people haven't seen Atlanta, but there was an episode in sort of like holding detention center, sort of like prison experience.
Oh, yeah.
And actually I think what it really showcased within that episode is like the bureaucracy that goes on in that environment, how people on the mental health scale are sort of all just lumped into this category, and actually you're dealing with a lot of people in those situations who are experiencing like different levels of trauma, hence why they might be in that situation. There isn't a lot of care in that situation. There was like a trans body in like a male, trans body in like a male space. So actually, I think that was a really like clever episode of how, there's like so many like multifaceted things that actually exist in our community that are kind of just all lumped into one group, basically, when actually there's like so many levels of being black.
Yes. And I was speaking to you yesterday. You did well. I was speaking to you, Jade, yesterday, and you were saying that another reason why you like using surrealism or magic realism is that you don't want to, first of all, traumatize your subjects, which you've explained, but also if we're speaking to minority communities, sometimes these things are experiences that obviously we already have, so you're sort of preaching to the converted if you're not doing anything new and experimental. So is that something that plays on your minds when you're making your films?
I think there's like two things when you're making films, which is obviously the first thing is that you want people to people to watch them, so you want them to like look good and be engaging. So that's kind of one level of using different techniques. But then I think there's also another thing that, again, coming back to documentary and like anthropology, I think I'm always conscious of like who's telling people about what. And sometimes I think when you've got this really intense film about like something that's seen as like an intense issue, it's like, well, I don't need to watch that because that might be like my lived experience. So why would I then go and watch something that I already know about myself? So I think in a way that's kind of why films like Get Out or things like Atlanta are really good, because there's like humor in them and stuff as well. And I think, so I've written a short film at the moment that's looking at like microaggressions that some East Asian women face, and it kind of ends up being like funny because one of them gets this like magical power and rage through like the re-experience of microaggressions and like having to hold that in. But then there's like quite a lot of like funny jokes and stuff in it as well. And I think it's making like being able to have those conversations, but then also bringing different bits into it, because I do want to make work about things like identity or things that I'm around, but you don't want to make something that always just feels really like heavy and dead, because it's also like you recognize that's people's life, not just this like moralistic issue that like we should all talk about. It's like a mixture between the both, if that makes sense.
I don't know, I sort of think you have to continually speak to the converted, because that would be to suggest that like everyone has like a similar like moral standpoint. I think like people are not monolithic. They sort of change over periods of time, and I think especially within the black community there's a lot of conversations we need to have, and actually if you have to keep reinforcing those conversations, and I just kind of think that's kind of what families do. So ultimately you just have to keep reintroducing new conversations, at the dinner table, and you might have the crazy uncle who's not into it, but like eventually he might like understand the point,
And I'm wondering why this sort of feels like a new movement, because Even at Manchester International Festival this year, we've got David Lynch who's like showing his work. And when you think of surrealism, you think of people like Lynch, not necessarily a filmmaker of color will come to mind. Do you think that people put limits on the sorts of art that minority communities are allowed to put out?
I think it's a really like weirdly interesting thing. I told you about this example before. Like one of the other films that you saw with the coloured rims was this film, which is a fashion film called The Temple of Sleepy Chan, and it's supposed to just be about like kind of taking the piss out of the wellness industry and like relaxation spas, but also mixed into being a fashion film. And we had a very diverse group of women of colour and women on set, and also all the models. And there was one white man who was the like head electrician, and he went up to my producer and was like, "Oh, is this a special film for International Immigrant Women's Day?" Not joking, because he was like so convinced that that's why this film had been funded, because he just had never seen that. So it was really weird because we ourselves are not limited, but then he thought that it must be like this special thing. Yeah. So I don't know.
I don't think it's new. I think it's kind of existed in generations before, but maybe our generation has more tools in order to get like things out. So by default, we seem to have like a larger platform to have bigger conversations. But ultimately, I think us as filmmakers need to like engage in conversation within ourselves like a lot more. Similar to what Emma was saying before, is like oftentimes you might feel isolated, and that isolation in terms of the success or lack of success of your work can either like fuel your ego or destroy your confidence. So actually, like I think it's really important to, for events like this, and actually just like on a personal level, just to keep speaking to people who make similar work or people that look like you, and just understanding that like, you know, it's all a craft and it's all a process, and you just keep going through it.
Also, to like really quickly add to that as well, with what you were saying about certain people being remembered as like the canon of things, it's also like who gets to be remembered. Like now I make an active effort to like go further into like research of like female directors and filmmakers from like Malaysia or Indonesia or different places that I might not have been taught about, because often in like, I didn't go to film school, but like the classic names that you'll hear about or you'll find straight away if you Google them will be like the same kind of people, and actually there is like a wider scope of like, you know, work from our heritage or like different countries and different people who just haven't been remembered in the same way. Like there's an amazing female surrealist filmmaker called Maya Deren, and like loads of her work has been shown in a, like relation to the male artists that she made work with, but actually she had like a huge canon of it herself. There was an amazing woman called like Ana Mendieta, who was another surrealist like filmmaker and performance artist, and her ex-partner is called Carl Andre, and like lots of his stuff has been remembered and other people's haven't. So I think also like within arts education and film schools, it needs like what we're getting taught about or heard about is more diverse, because otherwise it's just going to be like Quentin Tarantino again and again and again.
And just to tag on to the end of that, and also we run the risk of like erasing people if we just assume that like we're the sort of first ones to do it. I know like in the UK, the Black Audio Film Collective have been doing stuff for like forever, it seems. And equally, it was even in popular culture, you can see the other day, Stormzy was cited as like the first black person to headline Glastonbury when Skin from Skunk and Nancy had already done it. So I think our generation are quite privileged to have like the internet as a tool, but actually in doing the research, we could probably like help elevate some of the people that came before us and like showcase their work and not try and take all the credit.
Yeah, definitely, because it is spoken about as if this is the first decade in which you've seen black film, but I've definitely been watching films with black people in them before now, so you just have to sort of shout out the people who have inspired you. And to that end, obviously you said who had inspired you, but who's inspired you?
To be honest, like I say this quite a lot, and it's probably quite boring, but I am influenced by sort of people around me, to be honest, like my family quite a lot, because it's that thing once again. I think that like stories within the black community you don't hear enough of. So when you experience something, you're like, oh, this is like a new anomaly, when it necessarily like isn't true. Like my nephew's autistic, and up until like experiencing that, I wouldn't have like maybe cared to read about autism more than maybe start thinking of the grander scope of like what's autism like on the continent, you know, if there's only infrastructure here for it, like what's that like in like the developing world, so to speak. But aside from that, sort of like, you know, the Black Audio Film Collective over here, filmmakers like Haile Garima is like a big influence, and all the guys who did like the, I think it was called like the LA Rebellion, the guys that sort of did films, and then anyone who's disruptive, I'm a big fan of.
Cool. And we also went to Nigeria together to make One Day, Go Be One Day, which we saw a clip of before. And I was in the room when we were talking about that, and there were lots of people trying to like pull it in their direction. You had Carhartt in one direction saying we need to make sure that there's our clothes, and then we had Days trying to say, Kemi, you need to enforce a narrative on this because Akin doesn't like form. And that was something that came up lots, was you saying that you don't like, you didn't want to make something with form. Why is that something that was so important to you? And do you always go in with a really strong idea of like, the type of film you want to make, i.e., do you say, I want to make a surrealist film, or does it just gradually get weirder and weirder while you're making it?
I think it totally depends on the project. I mean, it's quite interesting hearing that back to myself, being like, I don't want to make something with form, because I always know it has to exist within a form. But I think specifically for that project, it was a film about Fela Kuti, someone who really like tried to push and pull and play with form. So it felt like only necessary that we didn't do another documentary about him that's like quite linear and talking about all the same things that we've spoken about like throughout his narrative and stuff. But equally, I also like to, I didn't go to film school, I did like a filmmaking workshop, but I also think that school's like a great place to learn, but equally, our creativity is also like subjective to the model of academia that's constructed. So if like film is curated from like a European-centric point of view, that's like, it's not really taking into account what like African filmmakers or what our level of creativity might be. So like I mentioned Haile Garima, I read an interview with him, and he teaches at Howard in America, but he just sort of says his first point of contact is to encourage his students just to go and make something, and then we can speak about form afterwards, because actually I thought that was really interesting practice, because it just means you're like just left to your own devices to make something creative, and then you can start refining it to what might be more common commercially or something like that. But also I like a bit of a fight.
Yeah, there were quite a few fights. And Jade, you were saying that basically sometimes it just comes down to telling a story in a different way. If you've heard about something like Jarl's Wood, or you hear about wellness over and over again, and you have a lot of films that deal with like gendered violence and gender-based issues, if we hear about those in the news, as a filmmaker, do you see it as your position to try and tell the most original story to grab people's attention?
I think there's like two parts with that. Is that like if you want someone to give you money for something, they're always like, why is this new? So like that there's something like in terms of you have to have like a relatively new idea or whatever. But I think especially if I'm doing something about something like political or like highly sensitive, I don't go into it thinking like, oh, I want to make this trendy and do that, because otherwise you end up like whatever Jenner it was in Pepsi.
Kendall.
Oh, that one, yeah. And like just throwing like things that have real meaning and like resonance to people's lives, and like throwing it into, I don't think you should be like, I want to make a film like this and I want to do it about that.
So you don't want it to be contrived, basically. And
I just think if you're going to do something, you know, as we talked about, like immigration and sexual violence, if you are going to tackle those issues and you're going to do something creatively different, you need to be prepared that people are going to ask you questions about why you did that, and it's going to be a really sensitive subject to them. So you need to be able to explain to them why you did it. And I think that's the place that I work from. I think also it's like, stuff about like detention and like the what women were going through in Yarlswood was like, I knew why I wanted to make it like that because I felt like it was missing from what I was seeing, and I knew why it was missing because it was kind of relevant in a similar way about films about sexual assault and the fact that we're taking a more sort of horror approach to it to sort of reframe like where people should be scared of things in society. I don't want to watch another woman get raped on screen. Like, that's not necessary. Like, why are you being so lazy in documentary doing that? Like, if you're supposed to be visually talented, then create something. Like, show me something new. And I think that's what I get really frustrated sometimes with documentary or like films. People are saying, oh, we're creative, we're like visual artists. Well, it's like, well, you're just writing and showing me exactly the same thing. And I think that's just like lazy. So show me something else that's going to like fit the image and the meaning together in a smart way. And I think that's what I want to do, because I don't think, especially if you're covering something to do with violence, you actually have to show it. And I think a lot of people do that because they maybe aren't connected to what they're seeing on screen, and it like seems this dissonant thing, and then they can just kind of, I don't know, like enjoy seeing it or something.
Yeah, so it becomes like sort of trauma porn. Basically.
Yeah, and it's like a lazy plot device.
And I'm going to start rounding this up because I've been given the nod. But what I kind of find interesting with things like, say, in Atlanta, the episode where they're talking about Justin Bieber and then he shows up and he's black, I just like that they push the limits of creativity. Like, would Justin Bieber be able to have had that rocky year where he was beating people up and then make the song Sorry and everyone forgive him? And in Sorry to Bother You, when people don't like it when he turns everyone into a horse at the end, but it does make a good point about capitalism and how it dehumanizes us. And so to that end, it really opens up your mind to think about why a filmmaker did that. So I just want to talk about the limits and possibilities of making surreal films. What are the limits to you, i.e., is it expensive? And is there something that if you were going to try and get into this, you would want to tell a younger version of yourself? And also, what are the possibilities? Like, what to you makes surrealism a really useful tool as a filmmaker? Big questions.
Where do I begin? So, yeah, I mean, like, money's always going to be an issue. But to be honest, I'm quite fortunate because I kind of realized early that if you're taking money from someone, you're going to have to make concessions on the story you want to tell. So often enough, I would maybe do like a commercial job, and then the money that comes in for that, I would try and make the thing I want to make. But I think, like, it's a craft, so the more you like further yourself into it, you sort of learn how to like mediate and communicate with people in regards to why it's important that you leave certain elements in as opposed to like taking them out. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. We speak about Atlanta, but I do think there's like a lot of brilliant British filmmakers who have been making stuff who maybe just like need their voices amplified like a lot more as well. I keep mentioning the Black Audio Film Collective, but I think there's always going to be challenges. So I guess it's kind of having an intention of why you're doing something, and then, yeah, depending on how you want to do it. But yeah, I guess like Chewing Gum is like a good example of that probably, because she made something that's quite eccentric, but. Yeah, I mean, like, money's always going to be a bit of a drama. But if there is a possibility, I'd always say, like, just try and make something with what you have, because actually that's more likely to be like an honest version of what you're trying to say as opposed to something more corroborated. But yeah, that answers it.
That answers it.
I think also things can be edited in a style that's like surrealistic or whatever. So that's not necessarily, or like shot in a way that you can go with like a horror cutting trope or like a surrealist look. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like you're putting really expensive special effects on it. Like with Sleepy Chan, we shot it really statically, like with the camera, and it's the cuts that make it surreal, and the way that it like jumps and the models look like they're apparating. That's just like kind of like quite a basic like way to make people appear. And then I guess like telling those stories and different things, it's interesting what people kind of see as eccentric. I was saying to you earlier that I think some people would say, like, the reason that I like that genre is because I think it lets you, like, create characters that maybe haven't had, like, a chance. Like, you can break, like, the sort of imposed stereotype in fiction. I think that's why people are getting called surreal or eccentric. And then maybe it's not, like, maybe it is someone that is like your grandma. I feel like some of the characters I'm writing, like, I know other Asian women like that, but then, like, to a white audience who maybe has met one Asian person in life, they're like, oh, that's so eccentric. And I'm like, okay. Like, so it's interesting, and I wonder whether we're just being allowed to, like, tell the things that seem kind of normal to us, and that's what it's getting called. So it'll be interesting to see.
And just to really add on, because you just triggered something, actually it's not always about what you film, it's like how you film it. So, for example, we work with like a similar editor, and the big factor just in life in general is like sonics, you know what I mean? Like, if you really think about it, like, you could film this room and you could put two different soundtracks, and actually something that's more like atmospheric will make it feel more surrealist. So actually, music and sound is probably like the most essential element in all of that. I mean, you can rewatch any of your favorite horror films and take out the sound, and it's just like a barrel of laughs or something. Maybe not, but actually, sound is just, you know, is someone once told me people forgive bad film, but they won't forgive bad sound.
Well, thank you both for joining me, because I feel like you're both building new ways of making films, especially in the UK landscape, and building new characters, and the style of you both is sick. So, to that end. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, if anyone wants to ask. Yes, Dad, what's your question?
That is the highlight.
Hello, daughter. How are you?
Hi.
I'm going to ask a serious question.
Yeah, okay, go on.
Surrealism, what does it do to the accessibility of film in terms of your commerciality and accessibility?
Good question.
I think it's good because in terms of if you're talking about commercialness, brands are always looking to like reinvent themselves visually, especially because of Instagram and digital media now. So like anything that they see is like innovative and is gonna rejig themselves. Like, I actually think it's kind of like fine because they want to like do new stuff in new ways. I think it's more like they can be more scared of like that content rather than the style, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I got told off quite a lot because I would say my subject matter, maybe in comparison to other people, is quite like boring, but actually, I think what it sort of does is, when you make something that people consider sort of like surreal or avant-garde, it kind of puts you in a bracket where, you know, for right or wrong, people are trying to do, like Jade says, something like interesting or something like left. And actually, funnily enough, is when they see black communities or communities shown in a very normal way, is considered maybe like quite, which to me is such a like a mind mash, because I'm like, I literally just filmed my mum sitting on a sofa and like zoomed into it, and then everyone was like, wow, this is art, you know? Well, to me it is, because actually like I love my mum and I wanted to be up on a pedestal, but equally I think in terms of accessibility, kind of, I mean, that's a brilliant question. I don't really know the impact, but I guess I'm sitting on the stage, so maybe it's like done a lot in that sense. It's a harder question when people want you for something, but really they want you for something else. You know, there's a lot of conversations about corroboration. They get you in the room and they're like, we love your stuff, now make something totally different, you know? That kind of happens a lot. But I mean, I think what's safe to say is that it definitely puts you, what I've learned from the stuff I've made, like filming my community in the manner in which, with the nuances I'm interested in doing, has put me in a lot more rooms than I would have ever expected. And I guess maybe that answers your question in a way.
I also just wanted to like add to that really quickly as well, is that like at the moment, because there is people like Jordan Peele with Get Out who people know well, and, you know, things like girldom and people doing different stuff. I think what I've noticed is people who are trying to sell me will now be able to compare me to, like, this person, and suddenly they wouldn't have the language to describe what they thought that I was trying to do. And then I'll hear them talking about me, and they'll be like, she's doing this kind of thing like that. And I'm like, I don't think that is what I'm doing, but because then they're talking about it to someone else to, like, sell me, but suddenly because they've got, like, things to compare to, they're like, oh, yeah, and people just kind of feel like they get it more, which is really interesting, because they suddenly feel, I don't know why, but it's like they've got the language to compare stuff, and then because these things are mainstream, more people feel like it's safer and people like it, and they're like, okay, we'll try that.
Yeah, it's also a balance, because you get in the room and then, you know, it's like we really want you, but we don't want your politics. So it's like, can you make that film, but with like everyone really happy or something like that? And it's like, yeah, well, that's not really the reality of the situation. It probably
I'm getting eyes from Liv. We need to get off the stage.
Okay.
Well, yeah, thank you for listening to us speak.
Cheers.